This video demonstrates briefly what it looks like to trip over temperature protection on a VRM. It's a total offshoot, unplanned video. We were working on delidding Bitwit Kyle's 7980XE for his new PC build, and while testing a heavy overclock and overvoltage, we encountered spiky power behavior and clock throttling when we weren't even hitting TJ max. This is a matter of inadequate cooling on the VRM. Even with the half-hearted attempt of adding fins that some of these manufacturers have for X299, you still need airflow or a huge amount of surface area, and it's not enough to come part way. We'll be looking at that and some Delid benchmarks in this one. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by EVGA and NVIDIA with the Destiny 2 1080 Ti bundle. The 1080 Ti SC2 comes with asynchronous fan control for its dual fans, 9 thermal sensors, and again includes Destiny 2. Learn more at the link in the description below. Let's start with the VRM stuff first. This is a complete side shoot discussion, but one that's worth exploring. We were doing some thermal paste versus liquid metal and sealant versus no sealant testing with the IHS and the substrate using Kyle's CPU, and ended up running into issues where the multiplier was bouncing between 12x and our set 45x, and that was with liquid metal and with thermal paste. With the thermal paste testing, we were hitting TJ max, so it looks like clock throttling because of TJ max, so you write it off as that. With the liquid metal version, we weren't really getting that close to TJ max, which is 104C. We were below 90. So the fact that we're dropping clocks from 45x to 12 says something's very wrong. And looking into it further, the first test that I do in that situation is touch the heatsink of the VRM. And if it feels like it's going to burn your finger within 3 seconds, it's probably too hot. It's not the most accurate test, but it's one that's right 9 times out of 10. So doing that simple test, put a fan on it, blasted the VRM with air, and therefore dissipated all of that heat. And lo and behold, the clock stopped the throttling. It was now holding 45x stable. And that is an example of what Der Bauer was talking about earlier this year when he was doing his X299 VRM disaster video. So basically, this was on the X299 ROG Extreme whatever motherboard, Asus's high-end board. And it's really not got the best heatsink on there. The problem is it's jammed in between memory, a high TDP CPU, a GPU backplate that has radiative heat coming off of it, and it's got no direct airflow because it's got these big towers of RAM and whatever coolers on the CPU surrounding it. And no, using an air cooler on the CPU is not going to fix it either, because all that air goes over the top of the VRM heatsink, not through it. So it's a challenge, and to fix it, you basically put a fan above it and blast it with air, and that solved the clock throttling. This chart of the average multipliers tells the story pretty well. It was all over the place, but we weren't actually tripping TJ max when under liquid metal. We were about 83 to 89 Celsius intermittently across all cores, averaging ultimately to 83.4 degrees Celsius. This isn't anywhere remotely close to the 104C throttle threshold for Skylake X, so obviously, again, something's wrong, and it wasn't the current limit either. But in this chart, you can see that the current fluctuation also reflected the frequency modulation, so it would be easy to think that it might be a current limit of some kind on the board. This line is ideally fairly steady and straight in a Blender-type workload, as each thread renders one tile ad infinitum until render completion. The orange and red lines are crashing against an unknown wall at this time, and it's not current, it's not TJ max, but the blue line remains steady. The question, of course, remains for what we changed with the blue line. And that change was adding the fan. So that fixed the problem. Basically, the VRM, when we went back and tested it later, was running about 120 degrees Celsius, because it's sitting there with a part that can pull 500 watts easy, and it's got 60 degrees Celsius sticks of memory on all sides of the VRM. There's rear I/O next to the left part of the VRM on the L shape, and then on the top side you have the part of the CLC or the air cooler or whatever it is that's really not going to be pushing any air onto that. The only way to cool that thing, the top part of it, is a downdraft cooler, and those aren't going to be any good for this type of processor. So that's the problem, and we fixed it with a direct fan. Now, something for Kyle to maybe consider with his $10,000 PC build he's taking the CPU for would be to look into the option of a full coverage block that would cover the VRMs as well. Depending on which board it is, I don't remember which one he's using, that may or may not be possible, but that's something to look into. Otherwise, just, I would say, Kyle, try and get some kind of fan on the top or in the side or somewhere to push air onto that thing if you're running it overclocked. Now, if you're just going to film it for pretty B-roll, run some quick tests, I'd say throw the fan in there for your test, take it out for your B-roll, call it a day. But the VRM that we have on our Asus board was not happy. It was very not happy. So yeah, that pretty much shows you what Bauer was talking about earlier. We might look into it more, stick a lot of thermocouples onto things. Didn't do it for this just yet, but it's an option for the future. So for the next part of this, we've got the benchmarks with Kyle's CPU doing delid versus lidded and sealed versus no sealant. This was just a quick round of tests. So we do fixed frequency and voltage to make sure there's no fluctuation. I have some auto charts in here at the end to restore perspective as to what the CPU does without any influence from all this stuff. And for the overclock, applied a simple 4.5 gigahertz 1.24 VID, which is what we found to be stable on our CPU. Now, 1.24 VID is pretty much pushing the limit of what I'm comfortable with a 7980XE. I'd rather be in the 1.15 to 1.2 range, but that's what we needed for our CPU. I have not tested what Kyle's max frequency and voltage is. I just applied what I knew would work. So keep that in mind. But all that matters is that they're fixed, so we can determine a delta between the lidded and delidded. Starting with delid results from our 4.5 gigahertz overclock and 1.24 VID, Kyle's 7980XE with TIM and Blender had several cores bumping into TJ max at 104 Celsius, causing clocks to drop multiplier to 12x. This isn't just the VRM thing here. This is actually just overheating on the CPU itself. We were not able to sustain the overclock during this test with our X62 at max speeds. We'd either need a better cooler or lower clocks and voltage. After a delid and some liquid metal, our heavy silicone adhesive attempt, wherein we used the adhesive on both layers and on all sides of the substrate and the IHS, that had us at TJ max once again. So even with liquid metal, it wasn't any better, which tells you that the adhesive was too thick because the liquid metal either wasn't doing its job or there were air pockets. Manually spreading the adhesive into a thin film on just the top layer of the substrate and only in the pertinent corners resulted in an 83 degrees Celsius average core temperature, resolving our clock throttling issue completely, at least once we had the fans going. The overclock is now stable and operates at 45x constantly. As for the GN parts, we were at 75 degrees Celsius with our unsealed IHS previously, and this was with a different chip, different liquid metal application, and without any sealant. So a couple of factors there to consider, but either way, it was running a bit cooler. Part of that is because of the lack of sealant, and part of it is just a different CPU. With Prime 95 fixed at 3.6 gigahertz and 1.15 VID, which by the way is aggressive, but that's because we want it to be fixed, the GN TIM unit operated an all-core average of 89.5 degrees Celsius, peaking at 90C, with the unsealed liquid metal variant at 72.4 degrees Celsius. That's a 17-degree improvement. Kyle's TIM unit ran out-of-box thermals of 86.6 degrees Celsius, peaking at 89 degrees, more or less what we saw for the most part. With a light sealant, again in only the most important areas, we managed a 76 degrees Celsius average and 77C peak. For peak-to-peak drops, we saw a 12-degree dip in terms of degrees Celsius for Kyle's CPU with the light sealant version. Keep in mind that these are two separate CPUs once again, so we can't definitively state that the sealant caused the 5C difference in entirety, but what we can state is that the combination of these factors resulted in a 5C delta. And Kyle's CPU still benefits from a 12-degree improvement from comparison against itself with liquid metal and a light reseal versus Intel's TIM. Out of curiosity, we also tested a medium seal on Kyle's CPU, finding that the output temperature was 78 to 80 degrees Celsius, up from 76 to 77. This basically had a line of silicone adhesive on both the top and bottom substrates, but it was thinned out from the original heavier attempt. We can definitively state in this case that the sealant caused the 2 to 3 degrees Celsius leap in thermals. Just because the rhetoric often gets out of control with delidding tests, let's keep in mind that these chips are 100% operable with the stock TIM. It's just a matter of how far you can push them. With auto settings, which introduce variance in voltage and power consumption, so we can't do an A-B comparison, the CPUs run at around 50 degrees with Blender or 50 to 62 with Prime 95. We don't use auto for comparisons between TIM and liquid metal because it's unpredictable and not really repeatable for testing. However, we're showing this here to, again, give perspective that yes, these CPUs can operate without a delid. It just helps to do it. So then while on that point, to recap why and when you would delid, delidding helps primarily in two things. Helping with thermals, it's not just because the temperature is lower that you do it. It's because by lowering the temperature, you give yourself headroom to lower the fan RPMs or buy a cheaper cooler. For example, in the blender test, we could throw a 360 cooler on there and fix the problem of running out of thermal headroom on Kyle's CPU with the original TIM, but it'd be a 360 cooler. It'd be bigger, it'd be more expensive. If you delid it like we did, you can run a 280 on there and get away with it just fine. So that's something to consider. Another factor, of course, is noise, because the lower the fan speed, the lower your noise problems. And also, there's a power leakage reduction. So for every 10-ish degrees Celsius reduction in CPU thermals, you get roughly 4% of your power back. It'll consume 4% less power for that 10C drop. And that comes down to power leakage, and we've demonstrated that in our past content with the 7900X Delid video and the 7980XE review and 7960X review, where we showed, again, power leakage reduction from delidding. So those are the two primary factors. The main one is noise, which is a byproduct of lowering your cost to entry by giving you headroom thermally to buy a cheaper cooler as well. Those are the main reasons to delid. Not necessary. It gets necessary, though, as you start overclocking towards the max potential of the silicon, because the silicon can do, in our testing, an extra 100 to 300 megahertz, depending on the chip, with a delid, because you've reduced the thermal headroom issues. So that's all for this one. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or subscribe for more, of course, as always. And Kyle will be uploading his own video of his $10,000 PC with the CPU that we delidded. I have to ship it back to him, so hopefully the liquid metal doesn't move around and cause problems for him when it gets back. But I talked to Bauer about how to ship it, so we'll do our best. Check that out when it's live. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.